You don't intimidate them because you're cruel. You intimidate them because you see. In a society that rewards performance, the man who sees beneath the act becomes dangerous, not because he disrupts the system by force, but because his presence reveals its cracks. When you walk into a room, you don't play the game, you don't ask for validation, you observe, you listen, you calculate what no one else wants to say out loud. And that, more than any insult or aggression, makes people uncomfortable, because your silence doesn't soothe, it studies. Soren Kierkegaard once said, "People understand me so little that they do not even understand when I complain of being misunderstood." And isn't that your life misread, dismissed, labeled as distant or cold, when in truth, you're simply precise? A mirror doesn't lie, and they can't stand their reflection. The intelligent man isn't feared for what he says. He's feared for what he doesn't need to say. The way he looks at someone and sees past the layers they've spent years polishing, you are not invited to entertain. You are expected to conform. And when you refuse, when you hold your center, people call it arrogance. They confuse your self-possession for rejection. But this isn't about arrogance, it's about energy. Yours isn't loud, it's rooted. And in a shallow culture, depth feels like drowning. You are the man who stops the room without trying, who causes discomfort without raising your voice. Because in a world addicted to masks, being real is threatening. They'll say you're too much, but what they really mean is you're too awake, too unwilling to nod along, too grounded to be manipulated. Most people, especially those who rely on confusion to feel loved, aren't afraid of being hurt. They're afraid of being seen. And you see them. Not the curated version, not the charming performance. You see the patterns, the projection, the unresolved trauma dancing behind their words. You offer no applause for their act, and that makes you unforgivable. Because what they call intimacy is often just agreement, and you don't agree. So they run, or worse, they try to shrink you to make themselves feel bigger. They rewrite your clarity as cruelty just to stay comfortable. But don't let their discomfort become your distortion. The problem was never that you were too much. The problem is you were too clear. Depth isn't gentle. It doesn't flirt. It dismantles. And most relationships today aren't built on truth. They're built on curated chemistry and emotional ambiguity. You were told that vulnerability is attractive, but what they meant was perform vulnerability. Offer just enough to seem human, not enough to make them uncomfortable. But you, intelligent man, don't perform. You expose. You observe. You ask dangerous questions like, why do we need to keep pretending this is love? Modern dating is ego theater. Two people playing roles they memorized from childhood wounds and pop psychology reels. The healer, the broken artist, the safe provider, swipe, match, repeat until someone sees too much. Then comes the panic, because performance thrives in fantasy. And your presence breaks the fourth wall. You don't chase, you don't flatter for effect. You're not trying to be chosen. You're watching, listening, filtering, not from indifference but from integrity. Kierkegaard understood this dynamic. He warned that despair is not when a man feels bad, it's when he loses himself pretending to be someone he's not. And in love, that despair plays out every day. We call it compatibility, but it's really submission. Pretend to need less, pretend to want more, smile, perform, survive, but you don't play that game. And that refusal to pretend, to perform, to offer an emotional facade feels violent to someone who's never seen love without control. Ask yourself, why do so many say they want emotional safety, but then run from steadiness? Why is consistency called boring and clarity labeled intimidating? Because unpredictability gives leverage. And when you refuse to play the chaos game, People can't position themselves around you. They can't lead you with confusion. Your steadiness is an insult to their instability. Your silence is unbearable in a space that feeds off noise. Most people don't want a partner. They want a participant in their drama, someone to reflect their emotional choreography back to them. You didn't. You see the masks, the mixed signals, the tests. You don't get angry. You just don't play. And that non-compliance, it breaks the illusion. They called it emotional unavailability. But what you withheld wasn't love. It was permission to manipulate. And because you wouldn't be confused, on command. You were branded cold. But coldness isn't the absence of emotion. It's the presence of boundaries. You weren't inaccessible. You were impenetrable by tactics. And that is exactly what most find threatening. Kierkegaard believed most people fear becoming themselves more than they fear death. Because the self, the true self, comes without applause, without an audience. And you, by simply being rooted, expose the fiction they were trying to survive inside. Your truth is not poetic. It's surgical. You didn't show up to impress. You showed up to see. And that kind of seeing disorients those still hiding in plain sight. They said you were too intense, too observant. But let's be honest, what they meant was you were immune to seduction. You don't fall for the mask. You wait for the soul. And in a world built on branding, that kind of patience feels impossible. So they leave or attack or ghost you, hoping to escape that one look that told them everything they weren't ready to admit. But here's the real tragedy, not that they couldn't stay, but that you were willing to meet them honestly, and they never stepped forward. And that, my friend, is not your failure. It's your freedom. So pause, breathe, let this land. Have you ever been rejected not for who you were, but for how deeply you noticed? If yes, then remember, the man who refuses to act becomes the threat. The man who chooses clarity over chemistry becomes unforgettable. And you are not feared for being cruel. You're feared for being honest in a system built on emotional illusion. Don't shrink from that. Stand deeper in it, because your depth doesn't kill desire. It kills the fantasy. And if she's ready for truth, she'll stay. But if she isn't, let her run, because the man who waits for real never waits in vain. You've probably heard it before, she just couldn't figure you out. And that's not a flaw, that's your firewall. You are the man they can't mold, the one they can't decode, manipulate, or file neatly into a role. And in a world that worships predictability, the man who cannot be labeled becomes dangerous, not because he attacks, but because he refuses to be seduced into submission. Society offers men 3 acceptable roles: the provider, the puppet, the passive protector. Play any of these, and you'll be rewarded with attention, validation, and temporary love. The provider gives endlessly and is eventually drained. The puppet performs on cue and is applauded until he collapses. The passive protector guards what isn't his and is blamed when it fails. But the intelligent man, the conscious man, doesn't sign that contract. He sees the fine print. He reads between the emotional lines. He asks, at what cost? He understands that most relationships are unspoken agreements of usefulness. That love is often a transaction disguised as destiny. And he breaks the contract, not out of cynicism, but out of clarity. Because truthfully, he isn't available for hire, he's available for connection. Kierkegaard described this kind of man long before modern psychology did. He called him the knight of faith. This man doesn't lead with image or bravado. He leads with awareness. His value isn't declared. It's realized slowly, quietly, and deeply. He walks inward before he walks outward. He speaks last, not because he lacks confidence, but because his words have weight. The knight of faith doesn't seek to be impressive. He seeks to be aligned. And that alignment confuses those who are used to masks. When others posture, he observes. When others chase, he filters. And when others react, he pauses. His masculinity is not in dominance. It's in discernment. He knows what deserves his energy and what doesn't. You've likely felt this misreading before. When you're fully present, they call you intense. When you don't explain yourself, they call you emotionally unavailable. You were never unavailable. You were simply unwilling to be consumed. And that distinction terrifies those who feed on approval, because most people don't want wholeness. They want access. They want to touch you without knowing you, to claim you without earning you. And when you refuse to be casual about your spirit, you become too much. But let's be honest, you were never too much. You were simply unmoved. And people who live in confusion always misread clarity as coldness, because if they can't control you, they will rename you to feel safe again. Cold, arrogant, difficult, detached. These aren't descriptions. They're defense mechanisms. They've never met a man who doesn't explain his value, who doesn't negotiate his identity, who doesn't lower himself to be loved. So when they meet you, they either run or try to rewrite you. But you're not a rough draft. You're already complete. You don't need to be edited to be accepted. You don't need to be resized to be worthy. And the moment you know that, something breaks. Not in you, in them. The game no longer works. Because the conscious man cannot be managed. He can only be met. And most people don't know how to meet anyone. They only know how to manage. So let this truth settle in. The man who walks with clarity is misread as cold by those who live in confusion. But that's not your burden to correct. That's their blindness to confront. At first, she was intrigued by your calm, drawn to your restraint, fascinated by your refusal to beg for attention. But fascination turned to frustration, because you weren't reacting. You weren't chasing. You weren't playing the script she'd rehearsed for years. The compliments slowed. Her texts grew colder. Then came the line, "You're just too intense." But intensity wasn't the problem. The problem was she couldn't predict you. She couldn't map your behavior onto the blueprint of the men who came before you. You weren't performing, so she had nothing to measure. No cues to control. No emotional levers to pull. And this, my friend, is where the collapse begins. Because when a man refuses to perform, he breaks the economy of manipulation, an economy built on attention addiction, fueled by emotional confusion, and protected by control disguised as desire. You didn't provide the rush, the emotional roller coaster, the passive-aggressive suspense that so many mistake for passion. You were steady. You were grounded. You were real. And that kind of presence doesn't give them power. It demands authenticity. Society doesn't reward this kind of man. It resents him. It calls him difficult, emotionally unavailable, guarded. But let's decode those words. Unavailable means you're not instantly manipulable. Guarded means you value your energy. Cold means you're done pretending. You didn't shut down, you just stopped dancing for their approval. And when that happens, their need for dominance kicks in. Because the moment they realize they can't make you chase, they try to make you apologize. They test you, they provoke you. They manufacture distance just to see if you'll react. And when you don't, they call it rejection. But silence isn't rejection. It's refusal to participate in a game you've already outgrown. And that refusal hits harder than any argument ever could. Why? Because it breaks the rhythm they've used to regulate every relationship they've ever had. Your stillness reveals their chaos. Your peace unmasks their panic. And now they're face to face with their own noise and no distraction. You've stopped being a role, you've become a mirror, and that mirror doesn't reflect desire, it reflects distortion. The stories they told themselves that they're lovable because they're needed, that drama is love. That validation is intimacy, all of it begins to crumble. And because you're not performing, they can no longer project. So they blame you for the collapse. They rewrite your restraint as arrogance, your patience as distance, your silence as cruelty. Why? Because it's easier to accuse you than admit they never knew how to love without control. They wanted a spark, you brought a lighthouse. They wanted mystery, you brought clarity. They wanted a puppet, you brought presence. And that presence was the one thing they couldn't manage. So, you became the problem. You became too serious, too thoughtful, too calm. But really, you became untouchable. Not because you closed off, but because you stepped out of the emotional marketplace. The marketplace that sells validation for performance, seduction for silence, and calls it love. You refused to buy in. You didn't respond to the bait. You walked right past the auction where men trade identity for intimacy. And that, more than anything, made you unforgettable. Because when you stop chasing, when you stop justifying, when you stop explaining your calm, you become unpredictable. And in the world of performance, the man who won't play becomes terrifying. So let this echo through your mind and settle into your bones. Stillness is dangerous to the addicted. And you, my friend, are terrifying because you no longer chase. Most people don't wear masks to deceive you. They wear masks to survive. The mask says, I'm easy to love. The mask says, I'm what you want. But beneath that mask, uncertainty, fear, a person unsure if they're enough without the performance. And then you walked in not as an audience, but as a mirror. You didn't clap for the mask. You didn't play along. You didn't get seduced by the show. You just saw, and seeing, without reacting, without rescuing, without begging. That broke the entire dynamic. Because your stillness did something dangerous. It exposed the game. You didn't accuse, you didn't shame, you just made the mask irrelevant. And without the mask, they felt naked not because you stripped them, but because you didn't join their illusion. Kierkegaard called this the leap of faith. The moment you stop performing, stop pretending, stop living for others and choose solitude over assimilation. It is a terrifying leap, one that most avoid. Because to stop performing means risking being alone. It means walking away from applause to find authenticity, and that's exactly what you did. You chose integrity over inclusion, clarity over connection, and that clarity made you the enemy, not because you harmed anyone, but because you stopped being convenient. You stopped playing the part when you no longer needed to be understood. You became unreadable when you no longer needed to be liked. You became unshakable. And in a world addicted to comfort, your presence became confrontation. You didn't say they were fake. You just refused to be fake with them. And in that refusal, their illusion collapsed. This is why you were pushed away. Not because you did anything wrong, but because your silence said everything they were trying not to hear. And so they called you arrogant, cold, detached, not because you were, but because they needed a reason to reject what they couldn't control. So here's the pivot. When your standards become an offense, it's not you who is arrogant. It's their illusions that are fragile. Most people don't wear masks to deceive. They wear them to survive. Behind every mask is a question too frightening to say aloud. Would anyone still love me if I stopped performing? So they become what's expected, smiling on cue, softening their edges, adjusting to stay desirable. And then you walked in, not as another performer, but as a mirror. You didn't cheer for the character. You didn't flirt with the script. You just stood there still, silent, and absolutely unwilling to pretend. That alone was enough to trigger a collapse, not because you exposed them, but because you refused to participate. In your stillness, the entire stage set fell apart. The role they played to be lovable, it echoed against your clarity and disintegrated. Kierkegaard spoke of the leap of faith not toward religion alone, but toward truth. The terrifying moment one stops playing along and stands as oneself. You took that leap. They didn't. And that made you unbearable. Because when you stopped performing, you reminded them that they still were. You weren't harsh. You were honest. And in a world that feeds on performance, honesty becomes hostile. The irony is they wanted to be seen, but not by someone who refused to be blind. Your gaze felt like judgment, even if you said nothing. Because deep down, they knew the applause they were earning wasn't for their soul, it was for their mask. You didn't shame them. You didn't mock them. You simply didn't flinch when the performance ended. And that was unforgivable. Because when clarity enters the room, the fog can no longer justify itself. So they pushed you away, rebranded your depth as distance, painted your standards as ego. Why? Because it's easier to exile the mirror than to remove the mask. You weren't too much. You were too accurate. And accuracy always feels like aggression to those hiding behind illusion. You didn't reject them. You just stopped adjusting yourself to be accepted. You didn't isolate yourself. You chose solitude over self-betrayal. You didn't set impossible standards. You refused to shrink into emotional bargain bins. So here's your pivot. A truth not said with spite, but with sovereignty. When your standards become an offense, it's not you who is arrogant. It's their illusions that are fragile. And your clarity. It wasn't cruelty, it was freedom. And freedom always feels offensive to those still living in cages. You don't walk alone because you're antisocial. You walk alone because most roads are illusions. The parties, the roles, the rituals of validation. They looked like connection, but they were contracts, silent agreements to abandon truth in exchange for inclusion. You saw the terms, be charming, not honest, be predictable, not principled, be small but lovable. And then one day, you didn't sign. You stopped pretending that your wholeness had to be downsized to be digestible. At first, it felt like exile. The silence was loud. The empty space where applause used to echo was uncomfortable. But then something shifted. That silence. It wasn't absence, it was clarity. It was the sound of you no longer explaining yourself to be understood. Silence, when chosen, is not a shield. It's a scalpel. It cuts away illusion, carves out alignment, and disciplines the soul. Kierkegaard called this the night of faith, a man who lives inwardly before outwardly. He walks through life unbothered by applause or ridicule because his compass isn't public, it's sacred. That man doesn't perform, he aligns. And alignment, in a culture addicted to theatrics, looks like rebellion. You used to overthink every word. Now you speak when it matters and stay quiet when it doesn't. You used to mold yourself into roles. Now you walk away from tables that require costume changes. There was a time you chased affection like oxygen. You made yourself small for the sake of staying close. But every compromise was a slow unraveling. You became so easy to love that you forgot how to love yourself. Until you woke up and realized proximity is not the same as peace. And being held is not the same as being honored. So you stopped asking to be chosen. You chose yourself. And from that moment forward, everything changed. You no longer worship love. You honor truth. And truth, unlike romance, doesn't beg to be liked. The awakened man is not ruthless. He is rare. He won't play lover at the cost of his integrity. He won't trade clarity for comfort. He does not audition for affection. He offers presence. And if it is not met, he walks not in bitterness but in sovereignty. This is not emotional detachment, it's emotional discipline. You feel deeply you've just learned not to bleed for attention. You want connection, not contracts. You want presence, not performance. You want intimacy, not enmeshment. So yes, you walk alone, but not because you're lost. You walk alone because you've outgrown the illusion of being completed by anyone else. Kierkegaard once said, "The crowd is untruth," and you've chosen to walk the path where truth doesn't need an audience. You're not misunderstood because you're broken. You're feared because you stopped apologizing for being whole. And in that wholeness, there is power, the kind that cannot be explained. The kind that can only be felt when the noise dies and you finally hear yourself again. You are not seeking to be loved. You are seeking to be real. And that, in this world, is the rarest form of rebellion. "I just don't know what you're feeling," she says it with a tilted head, a half smile, a tone that carries both curiosity and accusation. But what she really means is, "I can't predict you." And that makes me uncomfortable. Most women aren't scared of intelligence. They're scared of what intelligence interrupts emotional predictability, because most are conditioned not maliciously, but unconsciously to manage emotional cues, to read facial expressions like road signs, to respond to tone shifts like weather patterns. You were supposed to follow the script, get jealous at the right moment, reassure when prompted, mirror emotional volatility with expected warmth. But you didn't. You observed instead. You stayed still instead. You answered with clarity instead of instinct. And now she's spinning, because her methods, the ones that worked before, don't land on you. You don't reward drama with deeper affection. You don't chase after silence. You don't collapse into over-explaining when met with withdrawal. And that unreadability, that refusal to be emotionally summoned on command, feels dangerous to someone who defines connection by control. You're not giving her the feedback loop she's used to. You don't show discomfort when tested. You don't beg for closeness. You just remain centered, calm, sovereign. And that makes you an enigma to the untrained heart. Stillness looks like distance. To the unhealed heart, silence feels like rejection. But you're not detached. You're disciplined. You've simply outgrown the need to react in order to be felt. You've become emotionally exact, not to impress, but to protect. Because clarity without control is terrifying to someone who built intimacy on ambiguity. So she says you're cold, unemotional, maybe even robotic, but truthfully, she's just unused to a man she can't manage. You've become unplaceable. Because you won't be pulled into emotional orbit for the sake of false chemistry, you've stopped performing. And in doing so, you've triggered the scripts others were never asked to question. Don't take her confusion as a flaw or worse, a cue to soften. Let it be a reminder you are no longer fluent in emotional codependence. You speak a different language now, one of quiet presence, not loud reactions. One of internal steadiness, not external approval. You're not missing anything. You've simply outgrown emotional training wheels. You've come this far. You've stripped the mask. You've chosen solitude over submission. And now you stand at the edge not of loneliness, but of clarity. This is the moment where most men turn back, where the silence grows loud, where the mirror becomes a sword, where truth stops being poetic and starts being costly. Because to walk this path to its end is to accept a truth many never dare say aloud. Authenticity will make you lose people, not because you are wrong, but because you no longer serve their illusions. This is the moment where you're no longer asking, How do I get her to stay? But instead, what do I lose if I keep pretending? And that, brother, is the real question. Because every performance costs you a piece of your integrity. Every soft lie drains your center. Every time you dim yourself to be palatable, your soul pays the price. You don't need to be liked. You need to be free. And freedom, real freedom, doesn't come with applause. It comes with peace. Kierkegaard warned that the greatest danger wasn't failure, but losing yourself so gradually the world claps as you disappear. And now you've stopped disappearing. You've chosen wholeness over convenience. But with that choice comes a consequence. You will be misunderstood, feared, sometimes even hated, not for what you do, but for what you represent. A man who cannot be manipulated, a man who cannot be emotionally baited, a man who doesn't need the room's approval to walk with purpose. And that's the paradox. The more whole you become, the more alone you may feel. But the quieter it gets, the more clearly you'll hear your own voice. So here's the truth. You have two choices now. One leads back to comfort, but at the cost of self. The other leads forward into solitude, silence, and self-respect. One leads to applause, the other to alignment. One asks for performance, the other for presence. And no one can make that decision for you. There is no map, no guarantee, no promise of being understood. There is only this, your breath, your center, your decision to stop folding your truth just to fit inside someone else's comfort. You want love? Real love? Then you must risk walking alone long enough to meet someone who's done the same. Because only those who face their own fire will recognize yours. And maybe that woman comes. Maybe she doesn't. But whether she stays or goes will no longer define your worth. Because you didn't become a man just to be desired. You became a man to become yourself. And that self, he is not negotiable. So if you are here at this edge, then good. It means the noise has stopped. The performance is over. The clarity has begun. Now choose, walk forward. Even if your legs tremble, even if your heart aches, even if your voice shakes, walk anyway and let them call you intense, cold, arrogant, hard to love. Let them project, let them flee, let them misunderstand. Because none of that changes what you've become: a man who doesn't perform, a man who doesn't beg, a man who no longer abandons himself to be accepted. You are not cruel. You are clear. And in this world, clarity is confrontation. Clarity is revolution. Clarity is the final choice.